When you think of a serial killer, the image that comes to mind might be a shadowy stranger, a figure lurking in the dark. But in the late 1980s, authorities in Missouri discovered something very different. An elderly farm couple who, behind their gentle smiles, were orchestrating a deadly scam. Ray and Faye Copeland, ages 76 and 69 at the time of their arrest, would become the oldest couple in America ever sentenced to death. This is their story, a tale of poverty, deception, and murder that shocked the nation. A reminder that evil doesn't always wear the face you expect. For more videos like this, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Every story has a beginning. For Ray and Faye Copeland, their story didn't start with murder, or even with the farm that would later become infamous. It began decades earlier, during some of the hardest years in American history, when poverty, struggle, and survival shaped who they were and who they would become. To understand how an elderly couple could one day be branded serial killers, we first need to step back into their early lives. Ray Copeland was born on December 30th, 1914, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The world was still reeling from the First World War, and his family, like so many others, lived on the margins of poverty. The Copelands were farmers, eking out a living in a region already known for its hard soil and harder times. Neighbors would later recall that Ray was different from the start. He wasn't the studious type. He wasn't the dependable worker other farm boys were. Instead, he was quick to anger, impulsive, and prone to cutting corners. By the time Ray was in his early teens, he had already developed a reputation for troublemaking. Stories circulated about him stealing livestock, sneaking a calf away from neighboring farms, other times trading dishonestly at markets. Small crimes, perhaps, but enough to show a pattern. Ray had discovered something important about himself. He didn't have the patience for hard work, and he didn't care who he hurt to get what he wanted. Then came the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Oklahoma and the surrounding states were hit hardest. Entire crops failed. Dust storms swept across the plains, burying farms and driving families into ruin. Thousands became migrants, moving west in search of a better life. For Ray, the Dust Bowl years cemented his worldview. He grew up watching neighbors lose everything, watching his own family struggle to put food on the table. But instead of developing empathy, Ray grew bitter. He wanted money, he wanted security, and he didn't want to wait for it. Petty theft turned into more serious scams. Forging checks, reselling stolen livestock, cutting shady deals at cattle auctions. By his 20s, Ray was already in and out of jail. He wasn't a hardened criminal yet, but he was well on his way. While Ray was learning to cheat and steal, Faye Della Wilson was growing up in very different circumstances. Born on August 4th, 1921, in Harrison, Arkansas, Faye was raised in a conservative, deeply religious household. Her parents were strict, and as the eldest of several children, Faye shouldered heavy responsibilities from a young age. She was described as shy, polite, and dutiful. Faye learned quickly that her role in life was to serve others first. Her parents, then one day, her husband. In that era, especially in rural America, women were taught obedience, modesty, and loyalty above all else. But behind the neat dresses and quiet manners was a young woman who longed for something more. Faye dreamed of independence, of building her own family, of escaping the constant demands of her childhood home. And when she met Ray Copeland, a man who promised a better life, she was ready to believe him. Faye was just 19 years old when she met Ray, who was already in his mid-20s. He was tall, rugged, and spoke with confidence. Ray carried himself like someone who knew the world, someone who could take care of a young woman eager to start a new chapter. What Faye didn't know was that Ray also carried a criminal record, a history of bad decisions, and a volatile temper. But in 1940s rural America, people didn't talk much about such things. A man's past was often hidden, and women were expected to marry and stand by their husbands no matter what. So, in 1940, Faye married Ray. It was a decision that would tie her fate to his for the rest of her life. The newlyweds started their life together in Missouri, and soon enough, they had children, 5 in total. Outwardly, they looked like any other hard-working farm family, raising livestock, planting fields, attending church on Sundays. But beneath the surface, things were far from normal. Ray's temper dominated the household. He was controlling and often cruel. Faye, the quiet farm wife, took on the role of peacemaker, trying to shield the children from his worst outbursts. Meanwhile, Ray could never keep a steady job. Honest labor bored him, and he felt entitled to more than his meager earnings. Over the years, he cycled through one scam after another, moving the family constantly to outrun the law or creditors. By the 1950s and 60s, the Copelands were known for being unsettled, never staying in one place for long. Their children grew up under a cloud of instability, always aware that their father was up to something, even if they didn't understand exactly what. This pattern raised criminal schemes, Faye's quiet compliance. The constant uprooting of their children would continue for decades. What began as petty theft and bad checks in Ray's youth would eventually escalate into something much darker. Looking back, the warning signs were there. Ray's unwillingness to work honestly, his temper, his sense of entitlement, Faye's obedience, her refusal or perhaps inability to challenge him. The Copelands' early years weren't just the story of a struggling farm family. They were the blueprint for a deadly partnership, a partnership that, decades later, would turn lethal. By the time the 1980s arrived, Ray Copeland was no longer content with small-time fraud. He had a plan to make real money, and for the drifters who crossed his path, that plan would mean death. By the time the 1950s rolled around, Ray and Faye Copeland had been married for over a decade. They had 5 children, a home in rural Missouri, and to the outside world, they looked like any other struggling farm family. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind the walls of their modest farmhouse, life was marked by fear, instability, and Ray's unshakable belief that the rules of society did not apply to him. For Ray Copeland, an honest day's work was never enough. He wanted more, and he was willing to cheat, lie, and steal to get it. Ray had always been drawn to fraud, especially when it came to livestock. In rural America, cattle were currency. Buying and selling livestock could make or break a family. But the system was built on trust. Farmers often dealt with handshakes, simple contracts, and checks that weren't scrutinized until days later. For Ray, it was the perfect opportunity. He would walk into a cattle auction, confident and convincing, and bid on livestock he had no intention of paying for. He would hand over a check, load the cattle onto a trailer, and by the time the auctioneer realized the check had bounced, Ray had already resold the cattle for cash. This wasn't a one-time trick. It was a cycle, one that Ray perfected over years. Arrests followed. Yes, he was caught time and again for writing bad checks. But prison terms were short and fines were minimal. Each time he got out, Ray returned to the same scheme. He didn't care that it meant uprooting his family, moving from state to state, or dragging Faye and the children deeper into poverty and shame. To Ray, it was business as usual. Faye, meanwhile, did what she always did. She endured. Life with Ray was difficult. He was controlling, volatile, and often abusive. Their children would later recall a house where their father's temper dominated everything. Ray wasn't just tough on his family, he was cruel. If a child disobeyed, punishment was harsh. If Faye questioned his choices, she was silenced. And yet, she stayed. In her generation, divorce was unthinkable. Women were expected to stand by their husbands, no matter how bad things got. Some would later argue that this loyalty explained her role in the crimes to come. Others would say it wasn't loyalty at all, but fear. Growing up as a Copeland child was a strange mix of normal and abnormal. On the one hand, the kids attended school, did chores, and lived like any other farm children. On the other, they watched their father cycle in and out of jail, watched the family move again and again to escape debt collectors, and lived with the unspoken knowledge that their father was always up to something shady. Some of the children later claimed that they distanced themselves from their parents as soon as they were old enough, leaving behind the instability for more normal lives. Others carried scars, emotional ones, from the constant tension in the household. By the 1960s and 70s, Ray's reputation was well known in small farming communities. Auctioneers and farmers grew wary of him. He was the kind of man people whispered about: untrustworthy, sly, always looking for an angle. But there was also fear. Ray was a man you didn't confront lightly. He was tall, imposing, and carried himself with an air of menace. If someone caught on to one of his scams, Ray made sure they regretted it. Some recalled veiled threats, others remembered his explosive temper. He wasn't a man people wanted to cross, and that fear allowed him to continue operating in plain sight for decades. Through all of this, Faye remained by his side. To the outside world, she was the dutiful farm wife raising children, tending to the household, and sewing clothes from scraps of fabric. But inside the marriage, her role was more complicated. Prosecutors would later argue that Faye was not just an innocent bystander, but an active participant in Ray's schemes. She wrote lists of potential farmhands, kept track of names, and helped organize the fraud. Was she coerced? Was she terrified of disobeying her husband? Or did she willingly go along, trading morality for loyalty? Those questions would haunt her trial decades later. But one thing is certain: by staying with Ray, Faye became entangled in a criminal lifestyle that would eventually escalate into murder. By the late 1970s, Ray was in his 60s. Most men his age were slowing down, thinking about retirement or enjoying grandchildren, but not Ray Copeland. He was still scheming, still restless, still bitter that after a lifetime of cutting corners, he had so little to show for it. His old scams weren't working as well anymore. Farmers were becoming more cautious. Auctioneers were catching on. Ray needed a new plan, a way to make money that was faster, smarter, and less risky for him. And that's when the idea came. He would no longer write the bad checks himself. Instead, he would find men desperate enough to do it for him. Men no one would miss. Men whose disappearances would barely raise a question. The fraud that had defined Ray's life was about to take a deadly turn. For the drifters and transients who crossed his path in the 1980s, the price of Ray's greed wouldn't just be a bounce check, it would be their lives. By the mid-1980s, the Copelands had perfected a strategy that was as chilling as it was calculated. On the surface, Ray and Faye seemed like an ordinary elderly couple living out their final years on a quiet Missouri farm. But behind the rustic farmhouse doors, the two were orchestrating a deadly scheme that would eventually unravel into one of the most disturbing murder cases in American history. Ray had long been distrustful of banks, institutions, and anyone who tried to exert control over him. But he wasn't just paranoid, he was also cunning. His idea was simple but lethal. Hire drifters and homeless men to work on the farm, use them to help him acquire cattle, and then eliminate them once they had served their purpose. To outsiders, it looked like Ray was simply offering a chance at employment to men down on their luck. In reality, these men were pawns in his twisted plan. The scheme worked like this. Ray would send these transient farmhands to livestock auctions with fraudulent checks. The checks, written under the farmhands' names, would bounce. By the time the fraud was uncovered, the cattle would be resold for cash, and the worker would mysteriously disappear, ever to be heard from again. And when these men vanished, suspicion rarely fell on Ray and Faye. After all, these were drifters, men without family ties, men who society often overlooked, who would come looking for them. It's important to remember that this was not just Ray's doing. Faye, his quiet and seemingly submissive wife, played a crucial role in the operation. She kept the household running, yes, but she also kept the books. Her neat handwriting filled the ledgers that detailed when each man arrived, when they were sent to the auction, and when they disappeared. Some believe Faye was coerced, too afraid of her husband to intervene. Others argue she was just as complicit, acting as the record keeper in murder. Her notes would later become some of the most chilling pieces of evidence against her, as prosecutors pointed to them as proof that she knew exactly what was happening. As investigators later pieced together, the Copelands left behind a trail of victims stretching across the Ozarks. Many of these men were never reported missing because they had no families to speak for them. But the bodies that were eventually discovered painted a grim picture of just how far the scheme went. Here are the known victims connected to Ray and Faye Copeland's deadly plan. Wayne Warner, a drifter believed to be one of the first victims. His disappearance went unnoticed for years, until his remains were tied back to the Copelands. Dennis Murphy, another transient worker hired by Ray. He was last seen alive at a livestock auction, and his body was later found on the Copeland's property. Jimmy Dale Harvey, like the others, he was lured in with the promise of farm work. Harvey's remains were eventually uncovered, buried in a shallow grave. John Freeman, a man with a troubled past who crossed paths with Ray. Freeman vanished shortly after cashing fraudulent livestock checks. Paul Jason Coward, a young man, just 20 years old, who was reported missing after taking a job with the Copelands. His skeletal remains were later identified. Each of these men had one tragic thing in common. They were desperate, vulnerable, and willing to trust the Copelands with their future. That trust cost them their lives. The consistency of the killings was almost mechanical. Each victim followed the same trajectory: hired on the farm, used to commit check fraud, and then silenced. Ray's weapon of choice was a .22 caliber rifle, a small but effective gun. He would often shoot his victims at point-blank range, execution style. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves around the farm or left to decay in remote areas of the Ozarks. The callousness of the crimes shocked even seasoned investigators. These were not crimes of passion. They were cold, calculated, and repeated with frightening precision. The big question that still haunts many who study the Copeland case is, why? For Ray, it seemed to be about control and profit. He could get free labor, acquire cattle with little to no risk, and eliminate witnesses who might expose him. His entire life had been spent cutting corners, cheating, and manipulating. Murder, in his mind, was just another step in the process. For Faye, the motivations are murkier. Some argue she was trapped in a cycle of abuse, following Ray's orders out of fear. Others point to the meticulous nature of her bookkeeping as evidence that she was more than a bystander. She was an active participant. What's undeniable is that together, they created a system of exploitation and murder that thrived for years before the first alarm bells were raised. And perhaps most haunting of all are the victims we will never know. Ray bragged to acquaintances that he had killed many more men than were ever discovered. Some speculate that there could be dozens of unidentified victims, whose bones still lie hidden beneath the soil of Missouri farmland. For investigators and the families of the missing, that uncertainty is perhaps the most chilling legacy of the Copeland's deadly scheme. By the late 1980s, the trail of missing men who had last been seen working for Ray and Faye Copeland could no longer be ignored. Families were reporting loved ones who had vanished without a trace, and law enforcement began to piece together that many of these men had one chilling thing in common. They had been hired as farmhands by the elderly couple in Missouri. Sheriff deputies and state investigators started retracing the steps of the missing men. Time and again, their paths led back to the Copeland farm. Suspicion grew. What was happening behind those weathered barn doors? In 1989, investigators received a crucial tip from Jack McCormick, a transient who had once worked for the Copelands. McCormick claimed he narrowly escaped Ray's attempt to kill him after being forced to participate in a fraudulent check scheme. His testimony gave police the justification they needed to search the Copeland property. What they uncovered would shock the small community and the nation. One by one, shallow graves revealed the truth. The missing men weren't missing at all. They had been executed and buried across the Copeland property. Their lives ended for financial gain. Here's what investigators found. Paul Jason Coward. His body was discovered buried in a shallow grave near a hay barn. A single gunshot wound to the back of the head confirmed he had been executed. Wayne Warner found hidden in a shallow grave beneath farming equipment. Like the others, he had been shot in the back of the head. John Freeman, his remains were unearthed near a tree line at the edge of the property, also with evidence of execution-style shooting. Jimmy Dale Harvey, buried close to a creek bed near the Copeland's land. His grave had been hurriedly dug, and investigators noted the similarities: a single bullet to the head. Dennis Murphy, his body was found not far from a barn foundation. Again, execution style, no chance of defense. Each victim was a vulnerable drifterman who trusted Ray with the promise of work and shelter. Instead, they were lured into a deadly scheme, forced to write fraudulent checks, then silenced permanently when they had served their purpose. The weapon used in the killings was traced back to a .22 caliber Marlin rifle. Ballistic tests matched the bullets recovered from the victims. And chillingly, When investigators searched the Copeland home, they uncovered a handwritten list names of men who had worked for Ray. Next to some of those names, a check mark. Those check marks, investigators believed, signified which men had already been dealt with. The town was stunned. Ray and Faye Copeland had seemed like just another elderly farm couple. No one could imagine that behind the quiet country facade was one of the deadliest husband and wife teams in American history. What began as suspicions of fraud had exploded into one of the most gruesome murder investigations Missouri had ever seen. And with each body uncovered, the case against Ray and Faye Copeland grew stronger. The investigation had revealed their secrets. But the next challenge would be proving it in court, and determining how much Faye truly knew about her husband's deadly scheme. The trial of Ray and Faye Copeland began in the fall of 1989. For a couple who had lived quietly for decades in rural Missouri, their crimes had finally caught up with them. What unfolded over the following weeks would captivate the nation, a courtroom drama filled with shocking revelations, chilling testimonies, and a community struggling to reconcile the couple they thought they knew with the monsters revealed by the investigation. The prosecution's opening statements were precise and chilling. They described the Copeland's deadly scheme in vivid detail, hiring vulnerable men to work on the farm, forcing them into fraudulent check schemes, and eliminating them once they were no longer useful. Prosecutors emphasized the ledger found in Faye's handwriting, pointing out that each X represented a man who had been murdered. The visual aid left jurors visibly uneasy. The defense countered with a very different story. Faye was under Ray's control, a frightened woman documenting events she could not stop. They argued that Ray alone had committed the murders, and that Faye's role had been limited to bookkeeping out of fear and survival. Survivor testimonies became the backbone of the trial. Men like Jack McCormick recounted their terrifying encounters with Ray. McCormick described being instructed to commit fraud, and the threats he received when he hesitated. He spoke of Ray's calm, calculating voice, promising work and shelter, while a hidden danger lurked behind every instruction. Another witness, a former farmhand, testified about the first time he noticed men disappearing. He remembered Ray casually remarking about the problems with driftfish, a comment that, at the time, seemed harmless, but now took on a far darker meaning. Neighbors also testified. They described strange patterns of men arriving and leaving the Copeland farm, sometimes never to be seen again. One neighbor recounted noticing graves being dug behind the barn, but dismissed it as normal farming activity at the time. The prosecution's forensic evidence painted a damning picture. Bullets recovered from the victims were all fired from Ray's .22 caliber rifle. The trajectory analysis confirmed execution-style killings, each victim shot in the back of the head at close range. Forensic investigators also testified about the shallow graves and the locations where each body was discovered. Paul Cowart, buried near the hay barn, covered with dirt and straw. Wayne Warner, hidden beneath discarded farm equipment, discovered when investigators carefully excavated the area. John Freeman, found near the tree line, partially covered with branches, indicating an attempt to conceal the crime. Jimmy Dale Harvey, buried near the creek bed on the property, uncovered after methodical search using metal probes. Dennis Murphy, located close to the barn foundation, with bullet wounds matching the rifle found on the property. Ballistics experts detailed how each shot had been fired from the same weapon, confirming the systematic nature of the killings. Perhaps the most compelling evidence came from Faye's own handwriting. The ledger was meticulous, listing names, arrival dates, and the timing of disappearances. While the defense argued she had been coerced, the prosecution emphasized her detailed notes as proof she knew exactly what was happening. Prosecutors presented the ledger alongside testimonies from survivors, highlighting how the dates and details aligned perfectly with the victims' employment and deaths. The trial was tense and emotional. Jurors heard hours of testimony from law enforcement, forensic experts, neighbors, and surviving drifters. They were shown photographs, maps, and diagrams illustrating the systematic method of murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Observers noted that Ray rarely reacted, while Faye maintained a quiet, distant demeanor. Some reporters described the couple as emotionless and chilling, despite the gravity of the crimes. After deliberations, the verdicts were delivered. Ray Copeland found guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, becoming one of the oldest men on death row in the United States. Faye Copeland found guilty, receiving life imprisonment without parole, due in part to her age and the argument that she had been under duress. The courtroom reaction was a mixture of relief and horror. The nation was stunned that such calculated murders had been committed by a couple in their 70s. The trial left a lasting impact on the community and the country. It forced law enforcement, prosecutors, and the public to confront the vulnerability of transient populations, and the horrifying reality that greed and control could lead to systematic murder even by seemingly ordinary elderly citizens. The Copeland's case became a reference point in true crime studies, highlighting the dangers of manipulation, exploitation, and unchecked criminal behavior. With the convictions secured, the community could finally breathe, but the question of all the unknown victims and the full scale of Ray's murderous plans would haunt investigators and historians for years to come. With their convictions secured, Ray and Faye Copeland began the next chapter of their lives, not in a quiet farmhouse, but behind the walls of Missouri's prison system. For a couple who had operated with impunity for decades, the adjustment to incarceration was profound. Ray, sentenced to death, was transferred to death row. His reputation as a calculating, cold-blooded killer followed him inside. He quickly realized that prison life required a different type of cunning. Ray spent much of his time reading, writing, and scheming, though now his schemes were limited to legal appeals. Prison guards described him as quiet, meticulous, and unrepentant, often speaking to himself about how things could have gone differently. Despite his age, Ray remained physically imposing. Fellow inmates noted his commanding presence, even in a prison environment, though most wisely kept their distance. Faye, sentenced to life without parole, spent her days in the general population, though some speculated she had been coerced into her role. Her notoriety made her a figure of both fear and fascination among other inmates. Prison staff observed that Faye maintained her calm, almost stoic demeanor, rarely discussing the crimes. She spent her time in reading, writing letters, and quietly observing the routines of prison life. Some suggested this mirrored the quiet, methodical role she had played in the Copeland farm murders. Ray and Faye both filed multiple appeals over the years, challenging aspects of the investigation, trial procedures, and evidence. Ray, facing the death penalty, focused on procedural errors and the admissibility of witness testimony. Faye's appeals largely centered on claims of coercion and her role being less culpable than the prosecution argued. Despite these efforts, the courts repeatedly upheld their convictions. Missouri's legal system had firmly established the guilt and accountability of the Copelands, leaving little room for legal reprieve. Ray Copeland spent the remainder of his life awaiting execution, though he would ultimately die of natural causes before the sentence could be carried out. His final years were marked by isolation, reflection, and a growing sense of vulnerability, a stark contrast to the confidence and control he had wielded on the farm. Prison staff noted that Ray occasionally expressed frustration at his lost freedom and power, but never publicly admitted remorse for the victims he had killed. Faye Copeland remained in prison for the rest of her life. She continued to live quietly, largely avoiding conflict with other inmates and staff. Some reports indicated she reflected privately on her role in the crimes, though she never publicly admitted guilt beyond the legal proceedings. Her aging in prison served as a stark reminder of the consequences of decades-long criminal behavior. Once a matriarch of a murderous farm operation, she became a shadow of her former self, confined to a cell with nothing but time and memories. The Copeland's incarceration closed the chapter on their direct threat to society, but the story left a lasting impact. The victims' families finally had some sense of justice, though the memory of their losses remained. The case of Ray and Faye Copeland is frequently cited in criminal justice studies as an example of systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations, the dangers of unchecked greed and manipulation, the complexities of coercion and complicity in crimes committed by couples. Even behind bars, the names of the victims Paul Cowart, Wayne Warner, John Freeman, Jimmy Dale Harvey, Dennis Murphy, and others never fully identified, serve as a haunting reminder of the human cost of the Copeland's deadly schemes. Ray and Faye Copeland's story is one of greed, manipulation, and the consequences of lives consumed by crime. Their final chapter behind bars reminds us that no amount of cunning, deception, or control can ultimately escape justice. The story of Ray and Faye Copeland is one of greed, manipulation, and murder, but at the center of it all are the victims. Lives cut tragically short, often forgotten by society. It is important, even decades later, to remember them by name and the humanity that was stolen from each of them. Investigators were able to identify several men who fell prey to the Copeland's deadly scheme. Wayne Warner, a drifter, one of the earliest known victims, who vanished without a trace for years. Dennis Murphy, last seen at a livestock auction, later found buried on the Copeland property. Jimmy Dale Harvey, hired for farm work, his skeletal remains were discovered in a wooded area near the farm. John Freeman, a man with a troubled past, disappeared after cashing fraudulent checks. Paul Jason Coward, a 20-year-old seeking employment, whose remains were found buried near the barn. While these men are known, Ray Copeland bragged about killing many more. Some speculate that dozens of other unidentified victims remain buried in Missouri, their names lost to history. Each of these men shared one tragic commonality: vulnerability and trust in the wrong people. The Copeland case serves as a stark warning about several things. The danger of unchecked greed and manipulation. Ray Copeland's desire for profit led him to exploit and ultimately kill. Vulnerability of transient populations. Drifters and the homeless were easy targets, highlighting society's responsibility to protect its most marginalized members. The complex role of coercion and complicity. Faye's participation, whether out of fear or willingness, raises difficult questions about moral responsibility in abusive relationships. The importance of vigilant investigation without survivor testimony. Careful forensic work and diligent police work. These crimes might have continued undetected. The case of Ray and Faye Copeland left a lasting mark on criminal justice history. They are considered the oldest known serial killer couple in American history, a grim reminder that age and appearance are no guarantee of innocence. Law enforcement and true crime scholars often reference this case to study patterns of serial killings involving couples, the exploitation of transient workers, the integration of fraud and murder as a criminal strategy. The Copeland murders also brought attention to the rural, often isolated areas where crimes can remain hidden for decades, and how ordinary-looking individuals can carry out extraordinary evil. Ultimately, the Copeland story is about the people who were lost. It is their names, their stories, and their families who deserve to be remembered. Every grave discovered, every ledger entry read in court, represents a human life that was stolen, a future cut short. As we close the chapter on Ray and Faye Copeland, we honor their victims by keeping their stories alive, by ensuring that such crimes are not forgotten, and by learning the lessons that history has painfully taught us. The Copeland case may be over, but its lessons resonate. Vigilance, justice, and remembrance are the only ways to truly honor those who were taken. What true crime case has stuck with you or kept you up at night? Let us know in the comments. Your suggestion might be featured in an upcoming episode.